Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey. This is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to be chatting about how the Liberal Party is a bigger threat to Canada than Trump, Trudeau being set to approve dozens of appointments in the final days of his government, Mark Carney winning the Liberal leadership in a landslide victory, Canada's organized crime crisis, the Ontario Appeals Court allowing a $290 million class action lawsuit to be launched against the Freedom Convoy and its donors, as well as the power of politeness as outlined by the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. All right, let's get into it. So first off, we've got the real threat to Canada isn't Trump, it's the Liberals' post-national agenda. Canadian sovereignty no longer exists, eroded by Justin Trudeau's pursuit of a globalist agenda. The Liberals, backed by a billion-dollar propaganda machine, are manipulating Canadians into believing that economic hardships is their patriotic duty in the fight against Trump. Trudeau openly declared Canada a post-national state in 2015, stripping it of identity and aligning it with global institutions like the UN, WEF, and WHO. His government has handed China access to Canada's top security biolab, turned a blind eye to the money laundering of CCP-linked narco groups, and pushed policies that weakened the nation from within. Canada is being set up as a pawn in a broader war against national sovereignty, used to destabilize the US and secure global control. The same elites warning about Trump and Putin are the ones engineering economic decline, rewriting history, and enforcing ideological conformity. So, how much of Canada is there left to save?
I mean, not much, at least under the current trajectory. The Liberals' post-national agenda pretty much hollowed out the country's identity, sovereignty, and economic strength. So, I mean, you look at every institution from the media to the bureaucracy, and literally everything in between. They're directly aligned with this globalist interest in sort of this globalist agenda, not the will of the Canadian people, which is a real problem, obviously. I feel like the more Canada submits to the UN, the WEF, and these China-linked influence groups, the less control as Canadians actually have over their own future. But I think the reality is we still have an opportunity to push back here. Like, this fight's not over. If it were, I think we'd be gone, and a lot of other people would too. What I think is important is that people wake up, reject the propaganda, and demand leadership that puts national interests first, which in my opinion really highlights why this next election is so important. I always contextualize this because I think it's important. I don't think the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party are always the answer or are always the problem. But right now, the Liberal Party is the problem, and right now, the Conservative Party is the solution, or at least the best solution we have in Canada. And if you look at this issue specifically, we have an opportunity to elect a party that is going to push back against all this post-national fucking nonsense and work towards nationalism, which is actually a positive thing, especially with the way the world economy is going. We can start leveraging our natural resources, try to rebuild our economy, or at least some semblance of an economy, increase our productivity, and hopefully give us a chance to dig ourselves out of this. If we don't, then it actually might be too late, because if we continue down this path for another 5 years, I just don't know how expedited their agenda would be and what would happen. Like, I don't know how quickly they'll move in the next 5. I don't know if it'll be more of the same, or if they just need this last 5 years to sort of put the cherry on top and call it a fucking day.
Yeah, the way I see it, there's 3 possible paths in front of Canada at the moment, which one is to reestablish our sovereignty and actually make sure that our government in Canada is operating for the interests of Canadians, not, being very close with the Chinese Communist Party as well as all these international organizations. Or it can continue going down that path as you're talking about and, yes, essentially lose its sovereignty to these international bodies. Or I do see there is a possible scenario in the future where Canada does come under the purview of America in some sort of way, to set up this kind of North American, if Trump is very serious about setting up this North American hemisphere of defense against China and Russia, then he has no choice but to, if that's his end goal, it only makes sense that he would force Canada into it. It's one way or another. Be kind of like, hey, you guys can establish your sovereignty, kick these people out and this influence out of your country, and you can remain sovereign and be part of this North American essentially alliance, or if you're going to go that direction, I'm just going to play the cards for you.
There's a couple challenges with that. I think, first of all, you're going to get a lot of pushback.
Mm-hmm.
So it's how do you do it with some sort of peace? How do you do it so that people are on board in a sense? You can't have a hot war with the United States. It's not going to happen. So if they want to do it peacefully, I think the only way to do that is if we do not support ourselves militarily and they jump in and become a military force inside Canada. I think that's sort of a hybrid that I could see happening. The benefit of that for Trump would be that he would have a military alliance to the north of Canada all the way down. He could probably get to the Panama Canal pretty quickly in time to be ready for a third world war if it kicks off in the next couple of years. Now, if there's no imminent threat of war and there is a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia and things ease up in the Middle East, Trump's got more time. So he may slow play that strategy. But again, I think the only way that happens is if we become so economically weak that we kind of don't have a choice. And again, I go back to what I said before. That only happens if we continue to elect a liberal government that continues to push a green agenda, that continues to drive our economy into the ground and continues to tell us, like you said, that we have to sacrifice everything for this globalist agenda. If those people are in power, we're very weak, we're very vulnerable. If a conservative government, or if that the ideology behind conservatism these days continues to move this country forward, I think we're okay. I think it ends up being option A, where we have our own sovereignty and we just we actually do pull our socks up and rework our military so we can at least stand up for ourselves.
Well, and that's the outcome that I would see happening if America was to establish influence over Canada in a significant way, is it would be, I don't see it being them rolling tanks down into Ottawa or anything like that. What I see is them leveraging scenarios where they go, look, your guys' law enforcement agencies and your laws themselves, like Canada doesn't have a RICO Act that would allow us to take down all of these criminal organizations at once, right? Tie them to each other. So you guys don't even have, first, the political will for it or the political tools.
Yeah, the instruments aren't in place, right?
And so we're just going to do it for you. And so I would see that being some sort of establishing some sort of agreement where American law enforcement could operate in Canada, and then them also have, say, extradition rules where they go, if we carry out an investigation there, and we can bring them back to the States so we can try them in a court system there. Now, again, I'm not saying this is definitely what's going to happen, but that's the more, I think, realistic scenario with the whole 51st state kind of thing.
It's the only thing that makes sense, because you think about the 51st state stuff. The reality is, if he wants to get it done in this term while he's president, the only way to do it is what we're talking about, is just by infiltrating through peaceful means, by using your military to support Canada. That's the only way. Like, it is sort of subversion in a way, but you could pitch it as a great solution where you can save on military spending, but they have the reach that they want. So everybody kind of wins in a sense. It's not great for us. You know what? It's interesting. It's not necessarily not great either, because it really depends how you view it. Like, I think a lot of people go, no, I don't want Americans in here. I don't want their defense forces. I don't want their military. I don't want this happening. But it's like, okay,
China's military is in here. China's narco groups are in here.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, they have Chinese police stations. They have their own organized crime. But the thing is, we're not doing it ourselves. So violent crime is now worse in Canada than it is in the United States per capita. So you look at this and you go, okay, but we're not doing anything about it.
Right.
So as a Canadian, like as a relatively law-abiding citizen, I actually don't have a huge problem with it. I think you just have to have specific guardrails so that it doesn't become them slowly taking over the country. I don't know how that would work out, obviously, but if they were just to come in here and defend the nation, I don't have a huge problem with that, to be honest with you.
Well, this is where I find a lot of people that are,
especially if I can go to the U.S. Especially like Jonathan, and you can go to the U.S. whenever you want. Okay, deal.
Well, this is where I find a lot of people have the pushback on this kind of stuff, or that take the hardest stance against these kind of ideas. It's they have a false idea of what the alternative is.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of why I tried to frame that.
Because they think the alternative is, well, if we keep America out, then Canadian institutions just keep working perfectly and everything's going great.
Yeah, it's like, guys, this place is on fire.
You go, wait, no, you have no idea how bad things are within these institutions right now, whether it be the RCMP, whether it be the CBSA, all of this kind of stuff, how compromised they are with international crime and also just foreign
and we were talking about yesterday with CSIS, like you just look at, it doesn't really matter.
Right. Yeah, and so it's, I agree that if there was the alternative of Canada keeps working perfectly and this is, it has been, then yes, I would prefer that that scenario as well. But it's not, that's not an option on the table.
And you know, the other thing too, if you think about it realistically, if a third world war kicks off relatively soon, let's say that they broker a ceasefire, someone breaches the ceasefire, but everyone had time to rebuild their arms. So now the war kicks off even bigger. Trump's either got to put his foot down because now he's going to look weak if he doesn't come back hard, or Europe's going to go boots on the ground and it's, cross the red line. Third world war hits. Okay. Here's your scenario. Now, how many people don't want America here?
Yeah.
I'm not one of them. No fucking chance. But you want your, no offense, but you want your gay military? So that's kind of what it's become. They're more worried about rainbows than weapons. And like, I know I'm obviously generalizing and I don't mean that against everybody specifically. I mean, the institution is prioritizing DEI, LGBTQ, all these things that don't matter in a brotherhood that is built to kill people and defend a country. So yeah, it's a bit ridiculous. If we got to that point and the Arctic is a vulnerable position or a point of entry, yeah, I want America here. Yes, I do. Yes, please. 9 out of 10 are going to agree if they actually know what they're talking about.
It makes zero sense because if you look at the lay of the land, okay, who I'm going to align myself with as far as a superpower goes, because Canada is one of these pieces on a chessboard, right? That they're not the king or queen. We don't have that much power. We're not
Justin
that
Trudeau
important.
is the queen. What do you mean?
But we are a bishop or a knight in terms of we're not a pawn. We're not a completely useless nation. Like there is some economic output, there's resources, all of this kind of stuff, right? But, okay, you have to be on a team with a king or queen. And so you look at it and you go, all right, are we going to allow ourselves to ally with America or China? Those are the options.
Well, the thing is, if this third world war kicks off, there's no choice. Because right now we are infiltrated by China. But to the world, people don't really know what's going on and how embedded they are in our nation and what they're doing. And
we were letting their military train in our Arctic.
Yes, but people don't know. You ask the average Canadian, they'll say you're crazy for that. Yeah. They'll be like, no, that's insane, Liam. What are you talking about? Yeah. You don't know anything. All right, cool. So the reality is, though, if this became kinetic, this subversion of China, I think that would take a backseat very quickly because they are supporting Russia. So I think there may still be infiltration in Canada from China. I'm not going to deny that. But in terms of you got to pick a side, there's no choice. Yeah. You're choosing the guy below, you're choosing your partner to the south that's got the largest army in history. Yeah. End of story.
Like if your option is, okay, I've got to turn one of these nations into my enemy and I've got to turn the other into my friend, which one am I going to choose? Yeah, maybe it should be the one on your front doorstep and the stronger of the two.
Yeah, what are you talking about?
It makes no sense to go the other direction. All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Trudeau to approve dozens of appointments in final days of government. As the Liberal government nears its end, Justin Trudeau is pushing through up to 70 last-minute appointments, including judges, agency heads, and tribunal members. Critics argue that a caretaker government should avoid major decisions during a leadership transition, yet Trudeau is making sweeping changes just days before Mark Carney is expected to take over. This move mirrors Pierre Trudeau's controversial 1984 patronage appointments, which cost John Turner the election after Brian Mulroney exposed them in a televised debate. With an election likely before Parliament resumes in March, Trudeau's rush to secure key positions raises questions about whether history is about to repeat itself. So, should a caretaker government have the power to make major decisions, or is this an abuse of authority?
Yeah, so this is a blatant abuse of authority, in my opinion. You can technically say letter of the law, he can do it, but a government on its way out that's prorogued, in my opinion, has no business making sweeping appointments that outlast their mandate, really, right? And if you look at what he's done, he's stacked the deck for Carney. It makes sense. It's Trudeau loyalists, and this way his influence is going to linger long after he's gone. We're talking border agents, you're talking people at ports, you're talking obviously a dozen judges. And now don't get me wrong, we have a major judge shortage. They've been bothering him to do this for a very long time, but he didn't do it until now. So you understand why he did it. He did it to manipulate the system to move in the direction that he would like it to see moved. And what we didn't talk about yet is the Senate, which for me is maybe the biggest issue of all. He's appointed 94. He appointed 94 of the 105 senators. It's 90%.
Yeah.
Now there's 4 vacant seats. I don't think he chimed in on that, but I'm willing to bet Carney does it before there's an election. I'd be willing to bet if Carney calls an election in the next couple of weeks, if he does it, actually, at the end of the day, if they've already got 94, who really gives a shit? But there are 4 vacant seats, which could mean that the current Liberal government would have appointed 93% of our Senate, which is a huge problem, right? When you have, a legislative body that can make policy decisions that's been appointed by the sitting government who's now gone that wrecked this country for a decade, you have a huge issue, right? I just think a caretaker government should respect the democratic process and refrain from making these major appointments. Unfortunately, he's just more keen on cementing Liberal control over these key institutions. But like you said, if we look back at history, we already kind of know how this ends. With Pierre Trudeau's patronage scandal in 84, it backfired spectacularly. Now, it looks like the same thing may be happening again. I'm not necessarily sure that those two things, I don't think it's going to play out the exact same way. I don't necessarily think that the Conservatives will weaponize these appointments against Carney the way that they did in the 80s. That being said, there are a lot of other things to come at Carney for and the Liberal Party for. So I think that's the big difference right now is the sitting Liberal Party, Carney, Trudeau, the bunch, it's shooting fish in a barrel. Take your pick. You just kind of go, well, you guys have got 100 issues that I can pick on. And they're primarily corruption or things that are going to drive this country into the ground that I can prove that you've already done. So you can bitch about these appointments if you're running against Carney in the next few months, few weeks, whatever it may be. But ultimately, I think there's better lower hanging fruit that'll be more impactful. Either way, I think the outcome's gonna be the same.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at or contrast this to, say, Stephen Harper, who left a bunch of seats vacant because he was pushing for Senate reform.
Yes.
And they ended up actually forcing him to put people into the Senate because he said, well, I think we should either reform it or just abolish it, because they're an unelected body. So he said, I'm not going to put unelected people in there. And so you look at that, you contrast that to Justin Trudeau, who takes every opportunity he can to stuff loyalists in there. The hypocrisy is staggering when you look back at, say, comments in that famous video. It was so wild, so much projection. When he says he admires China's basic dictatorship, right? He said in that same thing, well, I can imagine that Stephen Harper would have really loved to have a dictatorship that he could do whatever he wants. But this is what we've created over the last 10 years is this authoritarian regime. And to your point, it doesn't matter whether it's Justin Trudeau or whether it's Mark Carney in there because the party line is the same, right? They've got an agenda. It's not, we have individuals within this party that that might be better suited to deal with a problem. So they're going to come in and they're going to try their approach. It's just a different person implementing the same exact agenda, right?
Yes.
So you just really get your choice of salesperson, not necessarily actually an entrepreneur that's actually going to create something or do something differently. But just to that point, I think this whole situation that we've seen unfold over the last decade with the capture of the Senate, as well as also even the legal system, where you look at how many judges in all of this are Liberal affiliated. It was there was a National Post article that said 77%. We're dangerously close to becoming a one-party country.
So this is the problem, though, with abolishing the Senate, because if you've got a minority Liberal government who creates a coalition with the NDP, and then you've got a judiciary that is supposed to keep them in check, which ultimately they're appointed by them, and like you said, 77% are Liberal anyway, and then you don't have a Senate, what basically stops them from becoming completely authoritarian, right? And that's why for me, I'm I still think we need a Senate. I just believe it should be staggered elections and they should be elected because they can make policy decisions. It's insane to me. So I think that if we could find a way to do elections for senators in 2027, Canada would be in a much better position, because the way that our judiciary works is not quite the same as the US. They're not really above, they're a little more equal to, and they don't really have the same checks and balances power that the US courts have over their government, right? So I believe it's actually crucial to have the Senate. It's just not the way that we have it, because right now all it is a weapon to be used by the previous party, depending how many seats there are to appoint. And what's interesting with Harper is he had the opportunity to appoint a bunch of seats, because, what's interesting about Harper is he had the opportunity to appoint a bunch of seats. I think he left, he's 22 open or something like that. But he didn't because he wanted reform. Then Trudeau comes in and goes, I reformed it, but he didn't. It was a liberal appointed committee that, so it was just basically one more layer. It's a liberal appointed committee. He appointed the people, and then they bring him the options, and then he basically selects anyway. And and people are like, oh, well, they're neutral. They're nonpartisan. No, they're not. Go look at any one of them, and you will find liberal ties. Many were part of the Liberal Party. Several worked on his campaigns. One was his campaign manager. So, when people are like, oh, it's nonpartisan. No, that's a lot of bullshit. And this is a big problem for me.
Well, even just the very concept that these people actually even respect the justice system or think that law and order should be impartial is completely blown out the window as soon as you bring in the SNC-Lavalin affair.
Yes.
Right? So Trudeau was trying to make the Attorney General override criminal charges on a company in order to have them avoid trial. So that they could continue getting public funding.
Which they're still getting under a different name.
Right. And so you go, okay, it is actually crazy when you look at, say, the legislative or the judicial system in Canada, all of this, just how backwards it is, because, all right, we've got a prime minister who's stepping down now, obviously, but I'm sure his replacement thinks about it very similarly, who doesn't respect the justice system or the rule of law. He thinks his party's politics should be placed above that. But then you've also got him loosening laws on violent criminals, taking away mandatory minimum sentencing, making bail reform easier. But then he's also putting more laws onto law-abiding citizens with gun crackdowns and all of this kind of stuff. And we're just getting more and more regulation, all of this. So you've got essentially a leader or leading party that really doesn't care. And then you've got them using that legal system to clamp down on essentially the good citizens, and also then loosen the leash on the bad ones. Like, how is this the scenario that we're in, and this is how our government has been operating? Yeah,
it's so it's challenging when you try to look at it logically. You break it down like that, and then they just throw some DEI banner at you, like, well, this is for equality. It's like, yeah, this is really bad for the country. You can implement equality measures without allowing criminals back on the street that just shot people.
Hey everyone, we hope you're enjoying this episode. If so, please consider leaving us a kind review wherever you're listening. If even just a quarter of our weekly audience did so, we'd instantly become one of the top-rated Canadian podcasts. We appreciate you helping us out, and now back to the show. All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Mark Carney wins Liberal leadership in a landslide, but what cost? Mark Carney has taken control of the Liberal Party, winning 85.9% of the leadership vote. While the media celebrates his victory, his deep ties to global finance and corporate interests raise concerns about conflicts of interests and elite influence. A former central banker and Brookfield asset management executive, Carney profited from policies that harmed ordinary Canadians. He has also shown hostility towards independent media, blocking critical journalists from campaign events. With no electoral experience, Carney represents continuity, not change. His leadership isn't a win for Canadians, it's a victory for the financial and political elite that have eroded Canadian sovereignty. So, will Canadians see through Carney's corporate-backed leadership, or will media narratives protect him?
So the media will do everything in its power to shield Carney, just like they did with Trudeau, right? Like there's no question. They'll paint him as a brilliant economist, a steady hand, and the man to sort of save Canada, conveniently ignoring his record of serving corporate and global interests. Those have been his priorities. But will Canadians see through it? I mean, it really depends on how much longer they're willing to tolerate being ruled by elites who view them as mere economic pawns. That's really what it comes down to, right? And will enough Canadians actually be able to get real information? I think that's actually the biggest challenge, because, you and I talked about this the other day. Everybody sort of builds their iceberg of information that becomes their identity, and you have to chip away at it to try to change their opinions, give them new ideas. And it's harder as they get older. It's a bigger iceberg. You and I were talking about our parents, my parents specifically. It's hard to get people to listen, and you can chip away and you can almost knock off everything you can see, but then, as you know, 90% of the iceberg's below the water. So with the older generation, I'm not entirely sure, unless you get someone that has spent their whole life being very curious, very inquisitive, not really trusting the government, challenging authority. Those people from the boomer generation, they'll jump on board. I totally see that. Now, with Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, I think it's a matter of how much exposure to the real information do they need to actually see things for what they are. So people that listen to us and have been listening to us for a while, they have a pretty good understanding of what's really going on, because that's really our mandate. Truth is sort of like my North Star, I find. It's not really about partisanship. It's more about like what's true. And I think if you've been listening to us for, the last year or so, you probably have a pretty good idea of what's going on, but it's how many people get that information. We're pretty limited, right? Because we don't have the funding and we don't have the exposure of these mainstream platforms. They probably, even though you and I do pretty well, I would say that anyone that's broadcasting nationally, at least 10x's our reach, I would think, monthly, So you think about that and you're like, that is really what shapes people's opinions and minds. So, the media will do everything they can to shield Carney, and that is 90% of the work, and then we've got this small 10% sliver with guys like us that try to fight back and give people that information. So it's sort of a twofold answer. Like, I think a lot more people would join us if we could reach them.
Right.
I just don't know how well we can reach them in today's climate, especially with all these different bills, C11, C18, if C63 kicks in, with the algorithms, with all the things that are in place. I actually think it's, again, we're outnumbered by my numbers. We're outnumbered 10-1, in terms of reach. But I also think it's exponentially harder for us to get out there. We don't have the budget, but we're up against all of these other pieces of legislation that are sort of stifling us. So I actually think the biggest problem is, even if people would like to see an alternative, I don't think they're going to get the information.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how things play out. You see, even now, too, some of Canada's political class taking aim at things like X, because that is the main alternative to their propaganda machine right now. But that's actually a useful perspective to have on propaganda as well, is that it's not meant to make the viewer or whoever hears it believe the lie that they're telling you. It's that they want to just drown the airwaves so that you never actually hear the opposite, a different perspective. But to your point, I do think a lot of people, as soon as they get this information, they do start thinking about things a little differently. And a lot of that too, and we'll circle back to this at the end with the Arthur Schopenhauer topic, but a lot of that is how you present the information to people too, because I think a lot of people say, even see things the way that we see things, it can be a little bit combative sometimes with people, and then so they don't even want to take in that information, because then they feel like they're on the defense. If you come off like you're attacking them, then automatically they're going to become defensive and be a little bit more unwilling to take in that idea or the information that you want them to.
That's just one more hurdle. Yeah, exactly.
If say they're a boomer and they're curious and they're able to ask questions, that's actually a good way to really get this information across to them through the form of just, say, presenting the information and then being like, what do you think about that? Like, make them think. Mm-hmm. Just go, here's a thing. Instead of like trying to beat your perspective into them, just try to get them to think outside of the box that they're currently in.
Yes.
And I think you can have a lot of success with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's definitely an effective way to get through to people. I think the challenge I have, though, is this needs to be done at scale.
Right.
That's the real issue. We're talking about federal leadership. So we have to have a megaphone that reaches 50 million eyes and ears a month to have an impact, to have a significant impact. And I agree with so you and I have the benefit of getting, we're probably closing in on 8 to 10 million a month, which is great. So you and I have the benefit of having more eyes and ears. So we can use that methodology to sort of explain or pitch the message or sort of push for some introspection. Totally agree with that. But the bigger challenge for me is reaching enough people to actually move the needle, right? Like you made a good point. So I would kind of summarize it and say the media outnumbers us 10-1. There's an exponentially larger challenge in reaching people because of policy that's in the way, which they've obviously done on purpose. And then there's the challenge, like you said, of people not wanting to adopt these ideas because it makes them unpopular with their friends, right? And then there's the other thing which I mentioned, which is, people have built an iceberg or a mountain of ideas and opinions over time that is very, very hard to chip away at.
Right.
So you have all of these hurdles to get over to try to convince people of the truth. So it's very challenging. This is why sometimes, like, we push and push and push and do what we do, and we try to inform people. But this is one of the things that makes me feel a little hopeless when I process that all at once, right? Because genuinely, like, how do you break through the entire boomer generation at scale? I don't think you could ever get more than a single-digit percentage on board. I don't think you can.
It might just be hanging on, keeping society like hanging on by a thread until they're gone, and then we can go, all right,
okay,
all right. Now we're not dealing with CBC.
You know what I mean? Yeah, like so it's tough.
I think at that point too, brought this up before, an analogy that Brett Weinstein has used, right? That, even, okay, if you're in a canoe on a river and you're headed towards a waterfall, at no point does it make sense to stop paddling in the other direction. And so I don't know, it gets, there's also a little bit, I think you and I both have something a little bit similar where I perform better if I feel like an underdog.
Right.
Like if, for instance, I always, even in golf tournaments or something, if I've got a 2 or 3 hole lead heading into, say, the last 5 holes, I start going through my head, this is like, oh, this is now my round to lose. Mm-hmm. Whereas the mentality on the opposite side, where, say, if I'm down 2 or 3 holes with 5 to play, I'm like, oh, this would be a great comeback.
Yeah.
And then you have a drive, rather, your mentality is really trying to make something happen rather than trying to avoid screwing up.
Yes. Well, everybody cheers for the underdog, right?
And so even with that said, even when I look at, say, yes, the Goliath that we're standing up against when it comes to, say, $1 billion, or even
more.
It's more.
Multiple.
It's definitely multiple $1 billion worth of propaganda
every year, just from the Canadian government. Yeah.
I go. That's a good challenge.
Cool. Just the 2 of us. We got this.
Yeah, we can.
But I will say, I'd leave this on a positive note, is that I'm the same, in that sense, I'm the same as you. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to stop. I do think we reach a lot of people. I do think we're expanding our reach. But the question is, will it be enough to shift Canadian perspective?
Right.
I don't think that we're going to see that for a while. Will you and I eventually, if you and I stay at this for 5 to 10 years, and we do see a lot of the boomer generation pass on, and we do see people, from Gen X, everyone's used to using, digital media platforms and digital news, and mainstream starts to flatline. Yeah, I actually think we can get there. I just think it's a super, super long road.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it is a patience game, and it's one that's going to take a long time to actually make a dent in. However, I think there's another perspective that needs to be added in here as well. That, okay, let's say this is the counter movement. We're trying to start not even necessarily centralizing it to ourselves, but trying to start a counter movement to the establishment in Canada, right? So in that scenario, I go, okay, if it's like, say, you're on a ship and you've got people that you need to paddle, there's a lot of people too in this space, and I'm not even taking aim at them, because I do understand how, yes, when you're looking in the face of this information all the time, it can seem like hopeless and demoralizing.
Absolutely.
But the people that take that, and that becomes their personality, and the way that they operate is from a demoralizing aspect, because you see it all the time with you make a post or something, and somebody will say, why even bother? What are we doing? Or something of that nature. And you go, you're not helping anything. Like,
no.
you're actually hurting your interests, because if you understand that this is a problem, and obviously if that's the scenario and you'd want something to happen about it, well, if all you're going to do is try to demoralize the people that want to do something about it, or push away the people that might think about getting in on the movement, or whatever,
you're just making it worse.
So it's like,
you're the worst kind. If you're aware of what's going on, and you're demoralizing others that are in the group, you're the worst kind.
Right. Like if you're on the ship and everybody needs to paddle hard so we don't go over the waterfall. If your position is not only am I not going to paddle,
I'm going to try to convince other people not to paddle.
Like,
yo, dog, I'm throwing you off the boat.
Get off the boat.
Right away.
Get off the boat, yeah. All right, moving on to our next story. We've got Canada's organized crime crisis, a nation run by criminals for criminals. The RCMP has revealed that Canada now harbors over 4,000 organized crime groups, up 400% from 2011. With an estimated 140,000 gangsters operating across the country, crime is no longer just rising, it's embedded in Canadian society. These groups aren't just violent, they've infiltrated the public sector, exploiting government corruption and weak enforcement to thrive. Trudeau's soft on crime policies, safe supply drug programs, and mass migration loopholes have fueled this explosion, while key officials have been tied to criminal networks. With Canada on the brink of an election, any leader who ignores this crisis is complicit in maintaining a nation run by criminals. So why has organized crime in Canada quadrupled over the past decade, and why isn't this a national scandal?
Oh, organized crime in Canada has exploded because the government's allowed it to happen.
Right.
That's just super obvious. When it's gone up 400% since 2011, that is all about government intervention. We suffer from weak enforcement, soft on crime policies, and rampant corruption. And it's honestly just turned Canada into a playground for criminals. Obviously, like if you can come here from another country, get slapped on the wrist and get out the next day, and then just take your fake passport and book out of the country, like what are we talking about here? These progressive policies like safe supply drug programs, lax immigration screening, and reduced sentences have done nothing but empower these gangs and cartels. They made it easy. What I don't understand is how did they think this was going to turn out? There is no scenario where you give people that do bad things flexibility to do more bad things and they don't just take advantage of it. That the stupidity involved in making these decisions is astounding, which makes me think that it's intentional. Really, that's kind of where I land, right? And obviously this should be a national scandal, but it isn't because the same institutions that should be exposing the problem are either complicit or too weak to act. Now, obviously the media won't touch it, as we know. It'll undermine the liberal narrative. When it comes to law enforcement, I actually believe they're underfunded, and I think they're handcuffed in a lot of cases from the top down. I think the people that are enforcing it would like to do something, but I think the politics and diplomacy and how these organized criminal groups have infiltrated these organizations, they don't really have a choice. And the politicians, I mean, many of them are tied to these fucking networks, right? Like you you've uncovered this, whether it's honeypot or whether they're actually selling drugs, like they're tied into this. So, Canada's crime isn't just a symptom of bad policy. It's the inevitable result of a government that refuses to protect its own citizens. And any leader who won't address this head on isn't just negligent. They're basically the problem.
Yeah. I'm fully on board with the idea now that there is no clear line that can be drawn between government, business, and crime. I think the three, I've started to see it less as, say, a conspiracy with, say, one organization or one group of people or whatever pulling strings to make it all happen. I think the more accurate way to look at it is a network of aligned interests. It's just different people in different sectors in their interests align in this scenario where, okay, look at, say, the Chinese narco groups and the businesses. This is a good example of how China, what we were talking about earlier, has infiltrated Canada. We'll use them as a case study, essentially. So you have this money laundering operation where you've got business people from China giving cash to organized crime in China. Then they fly to Canada, get a duffel bag of cash in Vancouver, which that money comes from the illegal activities of the organized crime group. And then the business guy gets his cash. He goes and cleans it in a casino, puts it into real estate, business investment here, whatever, right? And then the CCP, this is what's really interesting, is the government kind of comes in as a neural network and makes sure that, okay, as long as this economy that you guys have working, as long as it works in the favor of the Chinese Communist Party, will allow you guys to keep doing your money. So even, actually, it's really interesting, this book that I've been diving into, which is called The Mosaic Effect, and it's all about how China has infiltrated Canada since the 1970s and how this is essentially, we're at the culmination of like 50 years of geopolitical subversion, and now it's just getting to the point where it's obvious. But one of the things that the CCP will do is they're okay with that businessman getting the money out of China as long as that money is used for things like, invest in start a Chinese community network or whatever, right?
And so they can wield influence.
And then that community group, they now have influence over the Chinese diaspora.
Yes.
And so that now the CCP goes, okay, we now have influence over the diaspora communities to get political aims, because now we can get them to champion the policies we want to see in place in Canada.
Yes.
And so it's just this, like, it's this web between government, crime, and business. And here's another great example of it, actually, a case study from Canada. We've talked about them in the past. Seeing how this works with China, it instantly clicked in this scenario as well. Okay, you've got Randy Boissonnault, right? We broke this down months ago whenever he was going through all of the liberal Indigenous heritage scandals where he was lying about his Indigenous background. That was what dominated the media cycle. However, the real story where there was the corruption with his business, Global Health Imports, and the crime ties to Francesca LeBlond. So, okay, the three big players in the sphere of Randy Boissonnault is Randy Boissonnault, who was a cabinet minister of the Liberal Party, his business partner, Stephen Anderson, who owned and operated Global Health Imports, and Randy Boissonnault had ties to Global Health Imports. He had ownership stakes in them. And then you've got Francesca LeBlond, who shared an address with Stephen Anderson and Randy Boissonnault's business. So, okay, those are your three branches. You've got government, business,
corporate,
and
organized
drug
crime. Yeah.
And so let's see how that would play out with policies and such. Okay, you've got... conveniently too, right? The business is an import business, Global Health Imports. So you're running a distribution from foreign countries. Of course, okay, if you're drug trafficking, you've got your drug trafficker. All right, toss them into our shipments.
Yes.
And then, so, okay, we've got political front where we know since the 90s, the Liberals have been scaling back things like port security. They disbanded, Jean Chrétien disbanded the port police in Vancouver. And then you see all of these businesses start importing more drugs for the organized crime. And it's this connection between the three that just, I think, happens everywhere. And even back to, you look in the 60s and 70s, it was painfully obvious with the CIA working with mobsters, right? Like even, okay, after Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly killed JFK by himself, right? Who took him out before he could testify? Jack Ruby, who was the mob. So you've got this you've got this very intertwined network between government, business, and criminals.
Yeah, I mean, like even if you look at the CIA in the States, before they were the CIA during World War II, they had to work with the mobsters,
right? Because
they had to be able to get control of the port, which was all controlled by the mob. So they had this organization that was a government branch that basically brokered deals with them so that they could have control or at least be able to utilize the ports effectively during the war. So that was the entire intention of something like the CIA, is basically to be organized crime, but they're under the umbrella of the federal government.
Right.
That's all this is. And we have the same thing. And it was interesting when I took that in because it was a bit of a wake-up call. Like that's all that they are. That's all that they are. You can say that they move in the interest of America or the people, but they don't always. And you see, like they've murked presidents. They've killed leaders all over the world. In fact, I think it was not until I think it was in the 60s they took away their capacity to just kill world leaders. But I think up until then they were allowed to. Like it's just wild. So I mean, for me, you look at these organizations. The CIA is easy because they've done so much crazy shit, but it gives you an idea of the same kind of thing that's happening here, happening in Europe, happening all over the world. That's what these organizations do.
Right. And I actually think too that scales. Okay, so I've been drawing out this idea of like the different levels of society, right? So you've got individual, family, community, cities, regions, and like provinces, states, and then you've got nations, then empires.
Yes.
And then you've got all of the human civilization. At every level of those, crime, government, and business are linked.
Yes.
Like, even if you think about it on a municipal front, like that's actually where a lot of, when the RCMP, for instance, in that hearing was pointing out that they've infiltrated the public sector, there was like a RCMP report from 2021 that said it's like very common for organized crime to be completely involved with regional politics. Is like, okay, yeah, you've got,
Or they get contracts, they can move policy
Right.
along. I know enough people playing that game.
yeah. And so you go, that happens at the regional level, that happens at the nation level, that happens at the empire level.
Yes.
And so every step of the way you see these same networks operate similarly, but it just like essentially the stakes get higher.
Yeah, it seems to just be like the way of the world.
Mm-hmm.
It is just how those three things are intertwined. And it's just sort of, I don't know. I mean, it's a bit of a mess, right? But I think, back to the question here. I think we're at a balance.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're at a balance because at the end of the day, you and I know you can never nix organized crime. You can never stop corruption. You can't. But there's got to be a way where there's a more favorable balance for the people. And I just think it's way out of whack and primarily driven by bad liberal policy.
Right. And so I think it's not even. I'm very cynical now, to the point where I used to think it was incompetence, but now I see these policies as intentional, because you look at, okay, even I did another video just the other day about Trudeau being found in an RCMP investigation meeting, taking a private meeting with Paul King-jin, who is one of the heads of this whole Chinese triad and money laundering operation out of Vancouver. He's like one of the top dogs. There's speculation that there's one person above him who is an ex-Chinese military official. However, if Paul King-jin isn't the biggest shark on that scene, then he's the second biggest.
Yeah.
But anyways, he was taking meetings with Trudeau. He had taken another meeting with one of the Liberal Party members. And then, but you also even see, it's so crazy because you see in this Mosaic Effect book, they show how Paul King-jin, so he owns a business, right, where he launders his money through, a chop shop too. So definitely know that there's a lot of auto theft going on there. He had a warehouse that had a boxing gym, a chop shop, and a restaurant, and he would host politicians and stuff there for community events. Hey, you want to reach the Chinese community in Vancouver and try to get some votes out of them? Come by my business, and we'll do a night there and introduce you to everybody. You can have a chat. And they actually said that's part of the strategy with the Chinese Communist Party as well, is being like, yeah, take the Canadian politicians or whatever nation they're targeting. They do this stuff in America as well. They're like, take them in, throw them like extravagant parties, treat them like celebrities, just like get their ego to the point where they just want to go do these things because they're like, I'm a fucking rock star. And so, and they play right into it. And actually there's even in this book, there's quotes of people that have been like, yeah, I realized after like 2 or 3 years that I was completely being gamed, but
2 or 3 years?
Yeah.
You morons.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah, they have this is what they mean by useful idiots.
Yes.
And then so once they've got these politicians compromised and involved, then, okay, yeah, it makes sense why these policies like safe supply and mass migration are happening and all of this kind of stuff. You go, oh, this directly funds this essentially enterprise.
And you know what's interesting too? Like if you think about someone meeting with this Paul King-jin guy from government, like say Trudeau, for example. So Paul owns the boxing gym, the chop shop, and the restaurant. What are they meeting about? Because it's not those things.
Yeah.
You're not meeting with the prime minister to discuss. Those are small businesses. So you're meeting with him to what? To move criminal policy. It's the only reason, like to be a fly on the wall in that room. It's the only reason you people are meeting. Wild.
Or two, yeah, even getting the or even the leverage. Like, okay, if these guys have a lot of money and community leadership, right? They're community leaders within they're powerful and influential people within the Chinese diaspora in Vancouver, then they can just come in there as leverage and almost offering it as like, hey, we love your policies. We'd really like to.
Yeah, but that's quid pro quo. It's like for what?
For sure.
Because you don't walk in there and say, oh, we're going to do this for you unless you're like, and it means X.
Right.
You have to do this. Because it's like, you don't throw support behind someone until they do what you wanted them to do. Otherwise, they'll just tell you to fuck off later.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, like, yeah, anyway.
And what is crazy is in this book points it out too, is just how the CCP is the final say. Like everything goes, and how they'll even, if let's say a businessman in Canada that has a lot going on here as far as investment wise in business operations, but his business is still stationed in the CCP, they'll, like, if that person stops going along with the CCP's interests, they'll just seize their business, right? And so a crazy case study of this was how there was a company from a Chinese businessman that bought old folks' homes in BC, and then the CCP, he lost favor with them at one point, seized his corporation. So it was his corporation came completely under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And you think about what that means now. The Chinese Communist Party now owns old folks' homes in BC.
Yes.
Straight streamlined. And you go, how are we allowing this to happen?
What's actually interesting that I actually want to unpack a little bit there is the way I look at China is they've got these businesses within their country that when they hit a certain threshold, a government official basically becomes a part of the business. They're down the hallway in an office, and they are using all of these corporations like a chessboard. So even though you may want to sell your services to this company to make more money, they'll say, no. You're going to do it this way to this company because this is how this all works together for the CCP. So they can manipulate this. It's this massive game of chess. It's quite interesting when you think about it. So I was under the impression until now that this was isolated to China, where all these companies were Chinese companies like Huawei or something like that, right? And then they could wield this power over the world, leveraging the entrepreneurial prowess of their own citizens. But now you're telling me that they can have companies under their control where ownership may be in China, but the assets owned could be all foreign ownership, could be all foreign companies rather. So whether it's old folks home in BC, old folks homes in BC, or whether it's oil refineries in the Middle East, or whether it's, I don't know, our railway system in Canada. I don't know. I'm just obviously spitballing for fun. I don't actually know what
here's a good rock solid example of what we're talking about. So there was also another example in the Mosaic Effect about how a business bought up a zoo that was going under, and the book kind of says, like, okay, the zoo's it's not a good business in BC. Like this isn't in industry on the upswing. So like this isn't a good investment. Why? And the zoo was right beside the Canadian military communications base. And so it's like, oh, now we have a CCP-controlled company that owns a massive plot of land right next to military communications areas. Like, oh, you don't think they're going to be trying to pick up on those communications?
Yeah.
And so you see this even in America as well, like all across them. They use these CCP-affiliated businesses to, buy up property in key areas around things like military infrastructure.
Yeah. Well, it's just interesting. It just made me realize, like, you think about the reach they have. I think about it like they're fishing, and the dock is China, where they can cast out their rod and they can try to catch something in other parts of the world. But it's not even like that. They can move their boat to Canada. Right. They can move their boat to the United States and drop anchor there and then start fishing because they can control companies through basically a Chinese conduit. It just makes me still kind of grappling with it a little bit. It's just that their reach is so much more significant that way.
Well, it is, and it isn't in the sense where this is the exact same thing that everyone is uncovering about U.S. aid. This is exactly what America has been doing, and you even see it too, right? Okay, there was big news a month or two ago about how an NSA official was being appointed the board of directors at the OpenAI, right? And so you see these very pivotal companies within America as well, completely intertwined with, and then you see them, so
I'm not saying it's good.
That's
I'm just
the deep state for sure.
Yeah, all I'm saying, so it's happening at scale, not only from China but from other major powers around the world,
right? For sure.
Well, I think in reality, like, I think it's all bad. But let me say, like, if you know China's doing this, and you're America, how can you not be doing the same thing? It's like bringing a knife to a gunfight. You got to do it. And I don't agree with any of it, but I'm just saying, if they're doing it and they're beating you at it, and it's making significant it's making it a lot more challenging to maybe rule the world or keep your people safe or whatever the fuck their agenda is. Then you have no choice but to play the same game.
Right. Well, this is the whole isolationist idea, right? And people talk down about it because we've been highly globalized over the last 80 years or so. But okay, this is what I see happening on the world right now is we're decoupling this globalism where all of these countries are intertwined in such a degree where they're fucking with each other real bad. And so I see, right, okay, you've got these people within Trump's camp who's trying to say he's essentially trying to seal off North America from the rest of the world and have this be just a sphere of influence. And then you'd have something similar happen in Europe, East Europe through Russia, Asia and China, Africa, whatever. Okay, then I do think you can live in a world where these things don't happen, but if we're playing that game, whether it's, I mean, not us, because we don't have, we're not a major player in this, but okay, if America is playing this world domination game and trying to conquer every single country on earth and take over their political influence and business and all this kind of stuff, then, right, it's Newton's third law of physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. However, if you get somebody that has balls enough to come across and go, has the balls to say the world's about to start playing a different game. And that game is we have spheres of influence and we're not going across each other's spheres of influence anymore. I'm not going to, with Trump and stuff, dismantling US aid, he's going, I'm not going to try to subvert your countries anymore. However, I'm going to draw a line and say that you don't also come into this area and we respect these separate spheres. Yeah,
that's a tall order. It's interesting when you put it like that because I think it helps people understand a little more about maybe Trump's actions if they want to be charitable because it's a little wild these days. It gives you a little perspective on maybe what he's trying to accomplish and how there's an argument to be made that it's actually better for North America, Canada, you know what I mean? That does make sense, especially when you sort of unpack how deeply embedded China and these other countries may be.
All right, next story we've got. Ontario Appeals Court allows $290 million class action lawsuit against Freedom Convoy and its donors. Despite a court ruling that Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act was unlawful, an Ontario Appeal Court is allowing a $290 million class action lawsuit against Freedom Convoy organizers, participants, and even donors to proceed. The lawsuit, led by federal employee Zexi Lee, seeks damages for public nuisance and lost wages. Meanwhile, convoy organizers like Pat King, Tamara Litch, and Chris Barber continue facing legal repercussions. The government's crackdown on a peaceful protest with illegal emergency powers will go unpunished, yet those who stood against it remain entangled in the courts, exposing Canada's two-tiered justice system in action. So, what does this case reveal about Canada's legal system and its treatment of political opposition?
I mean, exactly what you just said, right? It proves that beyond a doubt, Canada has a two-tiered justice system. For me, the big issue is, for starters, the whole thing's a problem because you see protests against Palestine or Israel, you see protests against a bunch of different things that you might deem a nuisance. Like this literally says public nuisance. You know, it was outside your door for a year while you live downtown Toronto, right? But none of those people are in any trouble right now because it comports with the government's agenda. But this doesn't, right? So this is them basically wielding their power to stifle dissent. The problem is, if you can also find donors, you are going to crush freedom. You're going to crush, free thinking. You're going to crush free speech in this country because people will be worried about what happens. You know what I mean? If I'm supporting a cause that I believe is the right thing to do, and the government can now fine me to the tune of $290 million. Obviously, I don't know how that shakes out per person, but it doesn't really matter. Well, now I'm going to shut up. Now I'm going to self-censor. Now I'm not going to say anything, right? So it's been weaponized against political opposition. Like you said, it's just if you go against the government's agenda, expect to be smeared, sued, or silenced. This is mental.
Right. I see it very similar to the whole head on a stake outside of the kingdom idea as being like, hey, if you come in here and try to question the rule of the king, like this is the outcome for you.
Yeah.
And all of this, you see this. Okay. Yeah. How does a federal court rule that the Trudeau government infringed on those people's constitutional rights?
Yes.
You had another judge, I can't remember the exact scenario, but he ruled that the protest was legal.
Yeah.
And
Mosley.
Right, Mosley. Yeah. And So how are you allowed to sue these people for
after it's legal?
Right.
Like, I don't understand the legal framing here. Now, people will argue, well, it's a civil suit because, first it was this Zexi Lee person who is at the time, a 21-year-old federal employee.
Right.
From my understanding, too, where she lived was several blocks away from the actual convoy. So from my understanding, she wasn't even close enough to really be disturbed or be a public nuisance. Now, it started as a $4.8 million suit, and then she was able to get all these other businesses and all these other residents involved, and they made it this class action to this size, right? But I honestly think that all these people should be ashamed of themselves for even being involved in this. This is insane because you and I talk about this all the time. If you set the precedent that you can fine people for supporting a cause, one thing that's also, one second. What also pisses me off is in the case, they said that the people that were donating money to this cause should have, they knew or ought to have known that it was going to create chaos. Like, what the fuck does that mean? This is unprecedented. We've never had a case like this. We've never had this kind of issue. How could you know or ought to have known that this was going to create chaos? You were supporting a cause against government tyranny. So that whole thing, like that to me wipes this whole case right out. It's just insane.
Well, and crime lowered, right? So it's like, what chaos?
So now they've got all these businesses saying, oh, we lost all this money and it's been so hard on us. Like, hey, look around, idiots. What do you think happened to the rest of the country? Like 130,000 businesses went bankrupt. Like, don't give me this. Don't give me this. Like, oh, it was just so hard in Ottawa. You were locked down. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
That didn't make any sense. Anybody that's a part of this case right now should be ashamed of themselves. Sick to my stomach, anybody that's involved in this. I just hope I don't meet anybody. But what I was going to say is they're not paying attention to the reality that they're setting a precedent that says if you donate to a cause that does not comport with the government narrative, you can be fined.
Right.
And now those people go, yeah, let's fine them and then I'm going to get my money until you want to support a cause that the government doesn't approve of. You can't give them these kinds of tools. You can't give them this precedent. They should be backing out because if the government has this kind of power, the whole nation is in trouble.
Well, again, adding the more cynical perspective.
How can you be more cynical than that?
I don't think it's that some of these people are, and I'm not saying it's all of them, but I don't think some of these people that are supporting, say, this move are just ignorant and don't know that this precedent will be able to be weaponized against them in the future.
I think a lot of them are being opportunistic. Well, like, I could get some money for my failing business. It wasn't my fault. Yes, it was.
I also think this is the whole Michael Malice idea where he goes, low value people would love a social credit score because obedience is the only metric they can compete on.
Okay.
And so I think there's some people that just go, yeah, you weren't obedient. So like I can be more obedient than you. And it's it's in their personality. It's the same thing with the COVID lockdown. People, they were perfectly happy seeing the world be tyrannized
burned to the
as
ground.
long as they could stand in front of that authority and say, well, these guys are with me, right? The government's on my side, or whether it be about masking or whether it be about the thing. And so it's not even that, okay, there's going to be a protest down the line that they'll disagree with the government on, and then they'll wish that they never supported this. It goes, I take, again, that more cynical view of going, there will never be a protest that they don't that they go against the government on because they're just obedient. And no matter what protest is happening, they'll just take the government line on it.
Okay, so they're a bunch of bitches.
Yeah.
All right, cool. We're on the same page.
Yeah.
You just were meaner to them, sort of. My language is more vulgar, but you were kind of meaner.
I think it's a 10 to 20% of the population that is just that mindset.
Yeah, I think it's just nonsense and it upsets me.
All right, last story for the day. We've got funny that we go on to the after being very mean to those people. The story number 6, the power of politeness. Arthur Schopenhauer was a German philosopher best known for his work The World as Will and Representation in 1818. His ideas later influenced figures like Nietzsche, Freud, and Einstein. Though overlooked in his time, Schopenhauer's philosophy gained recognition for his insights into metaphysics, aesthetics, and psychology. So I actually was looking through Robert Greene's book, 48 Laws of Power, which is, fantastic book. It's definitely a timeless one. However, this was just kind of a footnote inside of this book, but it says, and it's talking about in the context of being able to be good at courtship, getting people onto your movement, like we were talking about earlier. So he says, it is a wise thing to be polite. Consequently, it is a stupid thing to be rude. To make enemies by unnecessary and willful incivility is just as insane as proceeding as to set your house on fire. Wax, a substance naturally hard and brittle, can be made soft by the application of a little warmth, so that it will take any shape you please. In the same way, by being polite and friendly, you can make people pliable and obliging, even though they are apt to be crabbed and malevolent. Hence, politeness is to human nature what warmth is to wax. I thought that was a pretty interesting analogy, because I do think that that's exactly what I was talking about earlier, where if you engage somebody's ego into the conversation, you approach it like you're on the attack, then you instantly put them into a defensive mode and make them harden, essentially, right? So that's where he's essentially saying, that politeness is the exact opposite of that. But so how do you think politeness impacts negotiations and persuasion in business and politics?
Well, obviously it is a strategic weapon, right, in negotiation and persuasion. And Schopenhauer understood that people like wax become more pliable when they're treated with warmth and respect. In business, politeness can foster trust and cooperation, sure. It can make deals smoother, definitely. In politics, I think civility can disarm adversaries and win public support. And in general, I think people are more likely to listen and to follow those who make them feel heard rather than attack. That being said, anybody I'm attacking, none of those people are listening.
Right, yeah.
Ultimately, I think politeness isn't about weakness. It's about control that allows you to sort of shape interactions, influence emotions, and bend situations to your advantage without unnecessary conflict. So I think it can be a valuable tool. However, when you and I are sitting here talking shit and we're podcasting, we're not really being rude to anybody. So I don't really, I think it all depends on what you want to get out of a situation, right? Like, I don't think, like, I'm always please and thank you with everybody. That's how I operate, no matter what it is, if anybody's going to do anything for me. I always ask politely. I never expect anything. I have no entitlement. And I think when you don't have that entitlement, you are inherently more polite to people. That being said, I'm still a relatively raw individual, and when we're talking about things like this, it's not really relevant, because at the end of the day, I'm just sitting here talking to you in a room, right? But I do think, like, you kind of go through life and you remember people, especially younger people, that are very polite and have a nice way of treating you, and it does set a tone, especially people you don't know. Like, there's the idea of this first impression thing, right? It's like, you have an opportunity to set, and you never know what kind of day people are having, but you have an opportunity to set an understanding of who you are to other people. And I think it's a really great way to put yourself in a really good light, regardless of the situation, whether it's business, politics, etc. It doesn't really matter. I think carrying yourself in that fashion, it's decent, it's respectful, but I think it gives you an opportunity to always be in a positive light with people as you move through the world.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
On that front, it is one of those things where, I know that on this podcast for sure, by even just the intro read of saying that the Liberals are a bigger threat to Canada than Trump, I immediately, nobody is making it past that wall that I'm talking about in the fifth topic, right? But either way, this in the personal life, this is actually something I've recognized from doing this, is that I think people can be thrown off sometimes how I carry myself in personal life if their first impression of me was from social media. Right. Or even at work too, when people find the social media because I never push my perspective on people. I wait, like, let's say it's the Trump tariff stuff or whatever, sure. And we're out in public. I'm never going to be the one to bring it up, and I'm going to just ask questions for you along the way that I know kind of make you have to think about a contradiction that you may have. Like, be like, oh, like how, let's say somebody's go, oh, these are unjustified, it's an act of war. Just be like, how common are tariffs? Like, how often do countries put tariffs on each other? Like, is that a thing? And then you can tell they instantly go,
They have no
I've never
information.
thought about this before. And they think that this is the first time tariffs have ever been implemented. And then you can go, oh, I don't know, let's Google it. And then,
Then they see your face, they're like, you sneaky fucker.
yeah. No, but it's not a manipulation thing either. It's genuine in the sense where I know that this is the only option that we have. And I don't really treat them like talk down to them that much, but I will.
Oh, tell me more.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely not putting on a face. But as soon as you do take that kind of approach, people come around actually super quick.
I agree. It's like the old, you catch flies with honey.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's how I kind of live my life. And it's interesting. Like I love my wife more than anything in the world, but her and I communicate differently. She's a lot more direct. So if you were thinking about how our relationship works and how we handle people, I'm definitely more the honey. She's more the vinegar. But if you know Megan, she's one of the most amazing people in the entire world. It's just, she doesn't even think. She just cuts through bullshit and she's just a little more direct. So it's interesting. Like, yeah, I think you and I navigate the world in a delicate space. And so even if we weren't naturally like this, we'd have to adopt those tools to be able to continue charting our course through it anyway.
Right. And in the way that I look at it too is, okay, if I push too hard, that means that person is always going to have a wall up against me forever.
Yes.
I'm not getting through it ever again if I push
I think
them
a lot
too
of people
hard in a
don't realize
conversation.
that.
However, if I come up short, if I don't push you hard enough, well, there's going to be another conversation a week from now, 2 weeks from now, where I go, oh, I can try to move the needle a little bit more.
Yeah.
Whereas, if you just try to go full force, then they'll just cut off that communication.
I think what it comes down to ultimately is thinking about being rude or thinking about being polite. If you're rude to somebody, you're not going to get anything.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends. Like every time you enter a negotiation or every time you have a goal, it doesn't really matter what it is. You know, if you're having a conversation with someone, there's always sort of an intention. That's why you're speaking to them. You know, if you are polite, you are exponentially more likely to get the outcome you want. If you are rude, unless you have a lot of authority over them and then shame on you for being rude, that's the only way you're going to get what you want.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not going to work out that way.
All right, before we get out of here, don't forget to head over to our Substack where you can sign up for our newsletter, which goes out 5 days a week. You can find the link in the description below, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.